Over the many decades of interviewing people in the agricultural, ecological, and other fields, one thing is clear. Long-timers point out that over the past 30 to 40 years, they've put into practice those principles that are sustainable, life-enriching, and stabilizing for our ecosystem. Soil remineralization, tree planting, organic, and permaculture farming prove that we don't need new science. We need more action in basic and practical ways from county to city nationwide. Joining us this hour is a wonderful teacher about farming the woods. Steve Gabriel joins us from the Wellspring Forest Farm and School in Ithaca, New York, and he has co-authored with Ken Mudge a 2014 release entitled Farming the Woods, an integrated permaculture approach to growing food and medicinals in temperate forest. It's a Chelsea Green Publishing 2014 release. Steve will join us for this hour for a fascinating exploration of how all of us can enrich our woodlands, grow food and medicinals, and support the ecologic and wildlife dependent on our shared resources. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve.
Great to be here. Hi, Dr. Zoe.
Good evening, and I'm just so enthralled when I found you. You know, I go searching online, which is a lot better than years ago when I was a broadcaster and there was no internet. And everything was you went to the library, you know, it wasn't so easy to find amazing people like yourself and books like yours, Farming the Woods. So talk to us a bit about how you got into this, because it's really rather unique way to work with the woods.
Yeah, well, thanks for that kind introduction. I got into this really as a young person living in a place that is surrounded by forests, and was lucky to meet people in my life that taught me to see, I think, some of the deeper parts of the woods and understand my relationship to it. And while I enjoyed sort of taking time to recreate, hike, and swim and kayak and do all these things out in the outdoors, it wasn't until I got to college that I learned about a lot of the ecological damage that we humans have put on the forest. And so that really spurred a long investigation into that, and it led me to understanding that we actually can have a really positive and interactive role where we steward the forest resource and take care of it and treat it with respect, and also gain our own sustenance, meet our needs for food and medicine and other things.
One of the things, there's so many things, your book is beautiful, and you talked a bit about, and I was really appreciative of it, is the historical use of forest by indigenous cultures, and that there was a much better understanding, I guess, of other permaculture guests I've had when we talk about the biome of the canopies of the trees and then the understory and then the ground, that it's not one-dimensional like so much of our sort of monoculture farming has been. And so the thinking often of the modern American is to think of food as something you buy at the grocery store that comes out of the fields where it's planted in thousands or hundreds of acres. But from the woods, who thinks about the woods?
Yeah, well, what's interesting to me is how just thinking about one type of food or one type of crop just lends itself to a whole story that relates back to this entire complex ecosystem and all the transformation it's constantly going through. And really, unlike a lot of the food we eat now, which is grown in annual crops, that pretty much looks the same, from year to year. What we see in the forest is something that changes every year and grows in its intensity and diversity and in its offerings. And the soil gets better every year. The habitat gets better every year. The carbon that's stored in the trees and in the soil gets increased every year. And so there's a real benefit to thinking about our sustenance. And certainly, native peoples, original peoples on the lands that a lot of us live on now, understood that relationship and treated it in a much different way than we have, and didn't see it just as a place for a couple of things to come out of, but really as home. And that's a really important tenet, to think about how the woods can be a home to all of us.
You talk about, as some of our other guests, I've been doing a series, and I've really been focused on agriculture and ecology since I was 14. So I've been at it a number of decades, and I commented in the introduction this beautiful observation that is really quite potent, that now, 2, 3, 4 decades now, we have people who have in the field, in their farms, like yourself and others around the world, who have demonstrated that by using the principles that we see in nature and applying them to how we steward the land, the water, etc., we will be able to create a very resilient and healthy planet by which our health improves, animal improve, etc. The thing about the permaculture concept is they talk about, and you do as well, planting of nut trees, fruit trees, berries. But most people will think of, I guess, what can grow needs a lot of sunshine. So share with us the truth about what can grow in temperate forests and why forests really can be a place you can plant and harvest.
Well, one of my biggest loves of the forest is learning about mushrooms and fungi. And any forested land that anyone walks on anywhere in the world, they're walking on a carpet that's not only full of living organisms, but of these incredible fungi that are small filaments moving through the soil. Sometimes in just a handful of soil, there can be millions of miles of this mycelium that is fungi. And what we do see is above ground or on wood is when those mushrooms fruit. And that the mushrooms are one of the most phenomenal examples of ways we can learn about the woods, learn about this complex and deep interaction between plants, and this long relationship that plants have formed with mushrooms for their benefit. And so I've been long engaged in both foraging and learning about what wild mushrooms are out there, and also in cultivating them. And there's several different types of mushrooms that anyone with a little space in their backyard even can start to grow and cultivate. And what's amazing about mushrooms to me is not only are we engaging in producing food while we're engaging in soil building, because by growing mushrooms, you're decomposing wood, you're creating the next soils, but also you're creating this food out of something we wouldn't think we could ever eat. We can't really consume wood and get any value out of it, but we can grow mushrooms on it and consume those mushrooms, and they give us a host of nutritional and medicinal benefits. They can heal some of the most pressing diseases that we face today as a society, and they can sustain us, and we can engage in that and learn. And so I really invite people, one of the first ways that we can interact is to think about interacting with fungi in the forest.
Well, I know when I walk through our woods or any of the woods in the Baltimore County in Maryland is where we live, you'll always see mushrooms. You'll see some that grow on the side of a tree. You'll see those beautiful turkey ones. You really do have to learn what to eat, what not to eat if you plan to forage. But I want to encourage our audience to go to your website, wellspringforestfarm.com. Is that right? Or is it Blogspot?
Yes,
it's .com. Okay, so it's wellspringforestfarm.com. And they have classes. They also advise at a distance. I mean, somebody in the listening audience may have 10 acres or something, or 3 acres or 2 acres, and they go, gee, I'd love to plant some nut trees so that the next generation benefits or whatever. So, but I asked you the question about this. Perhaps it's a misunderstanding on the part of most Americans who either haven't grown food in the woods or didn't know it's possible. When I was reading your book and in talking to other permaculture guests, they all talk about, oh yeah, berries, like the blueberry as an example. The wild blueberry will grow in the forest after the fires. And Anthony William, a psychic, said it's one of the great resurrection foods. I read how in your book you talk about, of course you can plant raspberry bushes in the woods and they'll do fine. But you often hear when you go to a nursery, you need at least 6 to 8 hours of sun.
Yeah, well, I think there's some advantage to sun, but also when we think about the forest, we also sometimes think about it as like really deep, dark shade, and really the forest is this incredible mosaic of light patterns. And there's a lot of plants that can benefit from having partial sun or dappled sunlight that the forest offers. One of my favorites that's native to most of the East Coast and all the way out to as far as Nebraska, is a really obscure fruit that loves growing in the shade. It's called the pawpaw. I don't know if you've ever heard of the pawpaw before.
I have, and I even saw the pictures. I've seen them.
Yeah, well, it's a phenomenal fruit. It was a fruit that was really a staple of many native peoples, and is actually something that supposedly Lewis and Clark on their westward expedition were actually known to survive on. It's kind of sort of like an avocado in its sustenance value, and it's one of these plants that loves to grow underneath the canopy of a lot of nut tree species like oak and hickory, and it can, produce this amazing fruit. It's also a host for the zebra swallowtail butterfly, and it often grows in floodplains, so it does a lot to hold soil from eroding away. And so there's just species after species that we see that that wants to coexist in different layers of the forest and offers these ecosystem benefits and offers wildlife benefits and offers a food benefit. So seeking those out and learning about them and forming that relationship, chances are your listeners have these trees in their backyard. And
I'm sure.
to know them, you start to see these different ways that these trees are interacting, supporting a healthy world and offering sustenance to those.
Well, if somebody in the audience is listening, they go, I would love to plant trees on my children and grandchildren's birthdays. There's a beautiful way to plant trees, sequester carbon, and if you plant fruit or nut trees, obviously there's another benefit, which is real food, if not for you, for someone else or the animals in the area. What kinds of nut and fruit trees should we be planting on the East Coast?
Well, there's a lot of different ones we could do. One of my favorites that would actually bear, potentially a nut crop for a lot of folks in their lifetime would be the chestnut. And the American chestnut is a species that was decimated by a fungal blight, actually, back in the early 1900s. But it's come back, and a lot of hardworking breeders have created a hybrid chestnut where they've taken the American and the Chinese and combined them together. And chestnuts produce some of the most nutritious foods in our backyards and can tolerate anything from pretty deep shade to full sun and produce a really high-value, high-yielding crop.
Mm-hmm. And what would be another one?
I think second to chestnuts would be hazelnuts. While it's not a tree, it's an incredible shrub. It's probably the nut-producing shrub that would sequester the most carbon. It has an incredibly dense root system.
And is that something that does well in the forest, or does it need to be outside the canopy?
We found through looking at research that it can get good yields up to even as much as 70% shade. So it is quite shade tolerant.
Fascinating.
The chestnut itself will grow for years underneath the understory of the forest, and eventually it does want to be in the upper canopy, but it can coexist in the understory for many years before that.
And of course, that's another reality, which is some woods areas get overgrown and the understory may not do well, or in our case, often there's so many deer that the deer eat a great deal of the understory, making it more difficult for the fox and the raccoon and other, woodland animals to hide and burrow well. Share with us a little bit about your perspective on the state of our forest on the East Coast, because that's what we're really focusing on right now is the temperate forests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like to draw the analogy that our forests are sort of like teenagers in that they're very young and they're in a process of regrowth. In most places where people step into the woods, they're stepping into a place that was once a farm that was pretty recently abandoned, probably in the last 100 years. And so the forests are going through this regrowth and kind of finding their way. And contrary to what a lot of people might think when they look at the woods, there's actually some benefit to sometimes going in and cutting some trees or thinning out some brush, as you say, in order to increase habitat and increase diversity. So it's not always a bad thing to cut a tree down. Actually, that can be a really supportive effort in the right way for the rest of the forest. So one of the things I love about looking at forests is we see these individuals, but really it's an entire community of organisms. And sometimes one organism may die, but the forest will live and it'll continue to grow and to thrive.
Exactly. I did have a question, then we have to take our first break. I've seen some really magnificent properties around the world where people have literally taken out of the forest everything but the big trees. So it's stunning to look through, but it looks a little strange. I mean, it looks very man-done or human-done rather than naturally, because they're beautiful. But what happens to a forest like that?
Well, what happens there is it's what happens when you remove all the elders from the village. We're missing something in that story. We're missing the story of the time and sort of a long journey through evolution. And so if we don't diversify the choices we make, then we lose that perspective, and we lose the genetic information that is allowing these forests to adapt to things like a changing climate and other pressures that we see increasing, like insects and disease. So the mixed ages are incredibly important, and it's incredibly important to ensure that some of these elder trees, die of old age while they're standing in the woods.
Yeah, exactly. I hadn't really thought about your statement about the woods being the old farms, but that's absolutely true. I even think about the acreage around where we live. Of course, it was all farms. The oldest tree is probably 250 years, and that you could see was like probably something that was planted there or was there and just didn't get disturbed. Our guest is Steve Gabriel. His book, Farming the Woods, an integrated permaculture approach to growing food and medicinals in temperate forests. And if the issue really interests you, I don't know that there's a better book. Again, Farming the Woods, and our guest is Steve Gabriel, and you can learn more at the website of their school near Ithaca, New York at www.wellspringforestfarm.com. wellspringforestfarm.com.
Hi there, my name is Mark Shepard, and I'm an agroforester, a farmer, and author of the book Restoration Agriculture, Real-World Permaculture for Farmers. You can find out more about me at restorationag.com. And you are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus, if I could pronounce Hieronymus correctly.
So, Steve, I want to come back to the whole general permaculture view of the world, because you commented on something. We had a little misunderstanding. What I was trying to say about the woods before was I'd seen woods where they only left the tall elder trees and got rid of everything else because it's so beautiful. But you're right. There are others who take down all the elder trees and leave everything else. But permaculture itself is a very particular way of viewing agriculture and the ecosystem, our relationship to it. And if you take a little time to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. And it's funny you say that, because I think I'm just so used to hearing, because usually what people do is they pull the biggest trees out and they leave them. So we're certainly in an interesting time. And I think when we think about our relationship to the forest, the biggest question I ask people is, when you walk into a woods, do you feel like you're a visitor visiting a place you don't know, or do you feel like you're a dweller in a place that is home? And when we think about that question, what we get to is this deeper idea of what humans have done for so long, which is really inhabit and exist within their own ecosystems and really have intimate connections to them, to the point where their survival really directly depended on the health of that ecosystem. And I think today we're in a place where nature is seen as something outside of ourselves and something that we visit or we enjoy, but we don't live within. And we can start to bring nature back into our lives and interact with it really wherever we live. It doesn't have to be just, folks like me that live out in rural places where there's lots of woods around, but really anywhere that we are. I love, actually, some of my favorite woods are these edges in urban and suburban areas where you find some of the most amazing types of wildlife and old trees and things like that. And you can really connect, and it's really just about spending time and observing and finding something to connect to. And so we see people that get excited about birding or just like to look at fungi and take pictures, or maybe just look, or even just sit in the woods and enjoy that sensory experience. And there's actually a word in Japanese, it's shirin-yoku, which literally means forest bathing. And doctors are said in Japan to actually prescribe this to patients who are suffering stress or anxiety, that they actually see this restorative benefit. And there's actually been research to back that up. So this relationship is not just about our sustenance, but also about our mental and emotional health.
The founders of permaculture, I've done a lot of shows on permaculture over the 3 decades that I've been doing this, and the thing that I commented to at the beginning of the program is the thing that has really struck me as the most beautiful outcome of 3 and 4 decades of people doing this work and showing, like Shepard did. I'm sure you know Mark Shepard?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so you guys, you're like brothers in arms with an understanding and an actual pursuit and the doing of it. It's not just academic talk. It's taking the time in your acreage, whether it's 100 acres or 40 acres or whatever, to really transform it in such a way that people really can see how you can be as part of nature and also nature's guardian. But permaculture itself is based on the principle, if I'm not mistaken, that you look at nature, and from nature, that's how you go about designing your farm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can use this observation I'm talking about, spending time. I mean, I try to take time just to ask questions about what's going on in the natural world and how that applies to the ways I'm growing food and cultivating soil and taking care of the ecosystems. And especially as we see a lot of different effects of climate change. We've had these really wild growing seasons where last year was historic drought for us up in New York, and the year before that was very wet, and we're kind of going back and forth, it seems. We see that nature, and especially forests, really do very well in both heavy rain events and also in drought. And so, the canopy cover, the diversity of architecture, and really the stability that a forest provides is real inspiration for us. So, our entire farm is constantly asking the question, what does it mean to farm and leave a forest in our footsteps? And so often the farm and the forest are seen as something separate, but we're really interested in pursuing bringing the two together. And one of the examples of this we really saw very clearly last year is the benefits of having trees with our animals. We raise ducks and sheep, and both of them they're wearing like down coats all the time out in the field. And so when it's 90 degrees day after day after day, they're really having a hard time, and they're stressed out. And we saw this firsthand where they really sought refuge and enjoyed the shelter of the trees and the shade and the humidity, the cool air that provided. And then, moving into winter, where we are now, the winds, it can be really rough, and the trees provide this incredible protection for them from the wind.
Yeah, that's one of the beautiful things in permaculture, where you use the trees to create a windbreak where you're planting other things. And it all just makes so much sense, because that actually is how nature works. But coming back to the issue of climate change, which is upon us, we're all seeing the instability. Our temperature has been fairly stable for about 8,000 years, and it's changing now. So in cultivating the woodlands, we haven't really addressed the state of our forests from your perspective. What are the eastern woodland forests state like?
Well, they are, like I said, they're in this teenage state, and they're on their way back. They're returning incredibly rapidly, and they're strong. They also have challenges because they're growing on soils that we've depleted through our agriculture, so the soils aren't as healthy as they once were. And they're also, because of climate change, there are certain species that have increased threats from insects, for instance, that are able to live longer. When we don't have cold winters to kill them off, or we don't have certain weather conditions, we see insect populations really doing very well. And so I'm sure folks have heard of the emerald ash borer, for instance, which is really a concern for ash trees. And what we're really likely to see with climate change is some tree species doing very well and faring and able to survive and thrive, and some that may not do as well. And so what's important, again, is diversity of species, and allowing for that diversity to ultimately determine who does well as our climate changes, because we just don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And so we can take another lesson from the forest, which has been around for thousands and thousands of years, and working on this problem and this adaptability to change, because that's certainly something that happens on Earth.
Well, I've interviewed a number of scientists and people who have been working with remineralizing the soil around the world. And when there was a problem years ago, I remember the late Chris Bird told this story many times about the black forests that were dying, and they took glacial rock dust and sprayed it all over the forest, and of course it helped remineralize, and the forest rebounded. And so there's a great movement worldwide that by remineralizing the soil itself sequesters carbon. And then if you plant trees, especially even in our urban areas, and we will be there's a group here in Baltimore called the Baltimore Orchard Project, and they help people plant fruit and nut trees in their neighborhoods with the same thing in mind as you have. There is such a way as creating more food, and if we would eat less meat, we wouldn't have to use up 2/3 of the biome for feeding animals. It just goes crazy. And 1/3 for feeding humans. I mean, we're really crazy as a society, rather sociopathic, to keep doing things we know are injurious to ourselves and the earth. When you look at, I'd just like to talk about, you're younger than me, so we're generation apart or so. When you look at younger people in their 20s now, how does this group of people strike you relative to all of these realities of an unstable climate, unstable politics, particularly right now for us in America? It's just crazy, wild, madman time.
Yeah, what strikes me about young people, and I work a lot with young folks, is their optimism and their retention of that connection to the world around them, and their understanding that equal rights for people and equal rights for nature are just logical. They're not a debate point. They really just are what makes sense. And so,
and when you, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead and finish your thought.
No, well, I was just thinking. What I think our role is to support that, is to not discourage that, and to support them to find ways to do meaningful work in the world. And I think we see that there's just so much demand both on the social and environmental scale. And what I'm most interested in are projects that can combine those two. So your example of these urban fruit tree projects is a great one, where we can do ecological work while we're doing social work at the same time.
Exactly. I mean, saving the planet is good business. It kind of makes sense to me. I was involved in Earth Day back in 1990, and my husband was in the first Earth Day. And I remember the politics just of trying to do something that was appropriate, and how difficult it was, because there were some groups in the environmental movement that didn't like the way other people. That has all changed. I have to say, I've been at this since 1966 or 7 or something like that. It has changed, and I'm hoping to see a greater coalition of environmental and ecological and agricultural groups, so that we have a much more effective impact in things like stopping the pipeline, which our new crazy man has said is going full speed ahead. How does it look like from you? I mean, because here you are up in Ithaca, New York, doing a wonderful job teaching people about forest restoration and growing medicinal food and all these wonderful things. How does the movement stand in your mind?
Well, I think the movement stands at a tricky point, where we're called to, like you say, come together and see where our interests and our concerns all align, because I do think they all link back to some single values and some perspectives that, we're really, when we look at the challenge of our civilization, what we've done to wreak havoc, we're really treating everything, whether it's a person, a piece of woods, an animal that's really being raised for our food. I mean, all these things are treated in such abusive ways. And so in shifting our perspective and really looking for care and stewardship and connection, I really think that we can start to turn those things around.
Amen to that.
See that that unification of our own understanding, that we can turn that in the opposite direction. What I see and what permaculture has inspired me is to see where there's situations. What we like to say is there's win-win-win situations.
Exactly, where everything is elevated.
Everyone's elevated at the same time. So
yeah.
I'm seeking those out and putting my energy into that kind of work.
Well, I think that's a brilliant strategy. I used to be a political commentator and a whistleblower, all during the Clinton and Bush era. And then I left and I went and did a lot of different things, and I've written 4 books in the time period since I left in 2002. And since this man, Mr. Trump, has come into the presidency, it is literally, and I just say this because we have a lot of longtime listeners, the first time since 2002, when I left full-time broadcasting, that I want to talk about politics. Between then and now, I've worked on all these wonderful things about cultivating our spiritual development and Kabbalah. And I just finished a book on the white spirit animals, and I'm circling around because I want to tell you something, because what you just said is pretty much in their own words what they said was the most surprising aspect of the work I did on the white spirit animals was at the end, they all talked about, this is the white bear, the white buffalo. I'm a telepath, and so I did a very unusual 2-3 year journey with them. They talked about the matrilineal traditions, and that was the thing they all emphasized, which is that we must restore a matrilineal society because fundamentally it's an ethos of care.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think once we open ourselves to that, and it's interesting you say, because that's actually been my experience where I feel called to talk political. Again, I was very involved in anti-war protesting during the Bush years, and departed from that and really got into this farming piece and saw cultivating the land and forming a relationship as really important work. And what I struggled with in anti-war protesting was I was always describing what I didn't like and rejecting what I didn't like. And my pursuit into farming and forestry is really to pursue the type of life and the type of work that feels good and nurturing and is building the world that I want to see. But I recognize now, for myself, in the light of these recent events, is that I kind of have to do both of those things. We kind of have to stand up and be really specific about the things we don't want, while at the same time building the things we do want together.
It's interesting. Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. And I think there are a lot of us who, just after doing it for so many decades before, and then Obama came in, and it was like we could take a little breath. And now it's not breath. Now you have to stand up for everything in every way as strongly as you can from wherever you are and whoever you are and wherever you are. And that's really, I think, what the world is being called to. We had on an astrologer the other week, and we were talking about this Pluto square Uranus, which is going on now and will go on till 2024. Well, that's extraordinary change and upheaval and radical fundamental shifts that are very dangerous. I mean, it can also be really great. Pluto brings out the dark side, but it can also bring out our resilience. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk some more about building resiliency, both as an individual, because you seem to be like somebody I can really, share some of the same, what's the right word? Not just values, but life experience. Our guest is Steve Gabriel. His book, Farming the Woods, an integrated permaculture approach to growing food and medicinals in temperate forests. It's a Chelsea Green Publishing 2014 release, and their website, www.wellspringforestfarm.com.
Hello, this is Carl Chesick, Executive Director of the Center for Honeybee Research in Asheville, North Carolina. Please check us out at www.honeybeeresearch.org. You can use volunteers, so hope to hear from you. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus.
Our guest is Steve Gabriel of Farming the Woods. Now, I also see that you are also the managing editor of Cornell University's Small Farms program. They're quarterly, right?
Yeah, the Quarterly, which is a newspaper we publish 4 times a year. Mm-hmm.
It's extraordinary. I didn't know about this either. I've been doing this beat for so many decades, and what's so beautiful is how many new things have been around that I haven't known about because I've been sort of not following it as closely as I used to. Share with us a little bit about the Small Farm Quarterly, because I think our listeners would just love to subscribe.
Yeah, sure. The Small Farm Quarterly is a newspaper. I mean, it's really unique, and I feel privileged in this day and age to work on a publication that still actually is printed on paper and mailed to people's mailboxes. And it really highlights this growing diversity of small farms and what it looks like to be a farmer in this day and age. We just see this incredible return to farming, and I would say it's a bit different from sort of the back to the land movement in that rather than wanting to unplug and detach from society, what folks are doing now as they return to farming is really wanting to do viable farm businesses that contribute in a positive way to the food system.
Mm-hmm.
So we're telling the stories of those farmers and also helping give resources and information around soil health and around even things like insurance and regulations, all that stuff that you just have to do if you're going to get into a business. Yeah,
I saw. I'm going to have on one of your editors actually, Petra Mann Page,
yes,
who does all the seed stories. It is very exciting for someone like me who started this kind of focus when I was 14, and to now be 63 and seeing so many younger families really care about the quality of the food they have for their children, really care about the quality of the future for the earth and the animal kingdom. And I think, like you said, we're past the tipping point in terms of knowing we're in trouble. And I don't think we've gotten, though, to the place where, what's the right word? There's a coherent voice with the power that it needs. And maybe it'll come from the Libertarian Party in the future. I don't know. But I do know that body politic plays a role in ecological health because as we move into this more oligarchical, corporate state, everything is ceded to the corporation, including beneficial laws that protect our water, like our current president saying, basically, to hell with the water and on with the oil.
Yeah, well, we see, and where I think resiliency really starts is in the community, and what's powerful about seeds and about food, and we're seeing this transform the corporate food system is when people demand that they want their food to be to be locally grown and grown in certain ways, it changes everything. And the market and the corporations have to respond, even though really they're ill-equipped to respond, because the very nature of the type of food that we're supporting is something that's decentralized and localized and celebrates culture and heritage of a particular area. It isn't something that you can find in every grocery store across the country.
And it's really true that local economies, though, are what make any nation resilient and sustainable. And that movement itself is part of a global movement, the local movement, so to speak, or local economies.
Or just the organic movement. It's the number of acres of farmland and organic cultivation increased 11% last year, which is just monumental.
Enormous.
So that's a real indication of something that's, I think, happening at the community level, but is becoming a collective voice.
Well, and I think also, when I look at the GMO, the anti-GMO movement, which I've been part of, and the anti-food irradiation, and all those things that are just craziness, you've really seen Europe seize that, and we're getting there. I mean, what was it? Vermont has passed a law, and Oregon has a labeling law.
Yeah, we're getting there, and I think actually the people are already there. It's just a question of when the lawmakers will catch up, because it's clear that overwhelmingly people want these labels on their food.
Yes, obviously. It's very true. So coming back, though, to your book and to your school, wellspringforestfarm.com, you had mentioned mushrooms. We've talked about fruit and nut trees, that's a wonderful thing for everybody to plant in your backyards. And you can call the Extension Service locally, wherever you live, to find out what species are native, which makes sense. But you also do things with syrups, maple syrup, etc. So share with us how you'd go about doing that and how any of our listeners could do that as well.
Yeah, well, maple sap and syrup are really a beautiful story, and for me it really connects me back to understanding and learning about this place that I call home, because syrup and sap and the maple tree are somewhat unique to the northeastern United States and down into the Midwest, and it's an incredible way to connect to the seasonal cycles of change, because the sap is running as the trees are thawing from their winter dormancy and starting to bring sap from the roots where they've stored the sugars from the previous summer, and they're pushing that up into the tips of their branches, and that causes eventually them to leaf out. And so when we tap trees, we're capturing just a small fraction of that in a way that doesn't harm the tree. And it's just incredibly, of course, delicious, but also nutritious food, very high in calcium. And one of the interesting things is people often think of maple syrup, but the invitation is actually to tap trees and just drink the sap. And this is something that humans have done actually more often, if we look historically, than consuming the syrup itself. So drinking straight sap, that's basically water with a little bit of sugar, is an incredible experience, and something anyone could do in their backyard if they have a maple tree, is to tap one and just consume that water. And this is something that Native people did traditionally and saw it as a way to cleanse their bodies from the winter and open up to spring. And there's nothing like the experience of tasting water that's been filtered through a tree. It's probably the cleanest water you'd ever taste.
I don't think I've ever done that. That sounds wonderful. You also work with medicinal herbs. Of course, we have, bloodroot and golden seal. Share with us some of the other medicinals that are native to our temperate forests here on the East Coast.
Sure. Well, the big one that people like to talk about is ginseng, being this incredibly medicinal root that is a wonderful thing to get into, because you're not only being part of something where we're growing medicine, but also where we're conserving our endangered plants. So unfortunately, a lot of medicinal plants that are native to the eastern forest are both, highly valued, but also really rare, and that's partially because of the health of the ecosystem. We've denuded the health of a lot of our forests, and it's also because humans have over-harvested in many cases. So ginseng is one that we're cultivating, we're learning. It's a long journey. It takes 8 to 10 years from planting to harvest. There's a lot that can happen, and so what I like and appreciate is, although that's challenging, and the forest constantly is doing this, is teaching us that change happens, but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes dedication. And one of my forest teachers, taught me that one of the amazing gifts of the forest is to learn that the actions that we put forth in our lifetime are not always the things we're going to see. It's really something we're planting for the next generation.
Absolutely so.
Medicinal plants and trees and forests, all these things are really teaching us that all the time.
I think it's one of the reasons I so love the city programs where they're growing fruit trees and nut trees as they are in the Baltimore Orchard Project here in Baltimore, because it means in generations, people will benefit by that, not only the shade and, we'll do a whole show on just how much energy is saved by putting trees back in our cities. But there are slower and faster growing trees, and I know that the willow is a fast growing and the elder. So like if somebody in the audience says, well, I have a great backyard and I haven't planted anything, what would be the most important combination if they say wanted to do a little fruit, a little nut, or some tree that grows fast and some tree that goes slow?
Boy, yeah, that's, that's like asking me my favorite tree. I kind of love them all, but you mentioned elderberry, and that's one I really encourage folks to plant because it does grow relatively fast. It's also a great, it's really a woody shrub, but it can grow almost as big as a tree, and it's a wonderful one, especially if you have like a wet spot in your yard, and it produces these incredible flowers which can be enjoyed just as they're flowers or made into some kind of tea, or some people even make elderflower wine, which is quite amazing. But then the berries themselves also can be, we make elderberry extract at our farm, which is from the berries, and that is really nature's solution to the cold and flu. I almost look forward to getting a little sniffle in the winter because it means I get to dip into the elderberry. And it's incredible. It's really high in antioxidants and vitamin C, and it's literally in our medicine cabinet and something that we really value for the cold and flu season.
So elderberry. And willow, of course, likes water and grows fast.
It does, yeah. Willow's a wonderful tree, and we do a number of workshops where we also weave willow. So it's really fun because then you're growing this material that suddenly you can turn into a useful basket or some kind of art project.
For
so
people
those
who...
and, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, just one more I was thinking of. The sycamore is a wonderful tree, and that's actually another interesting one because not only does it grow fast and like wet feet, but beautiful bark, and you can actually tap that one as well and drink the sap. And it's supposed to have a bit of a butterscotch-type flavor to it.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. We have a number of callers who have asked questions, and I'm just getting them. One is to talk about the forest chestnuts. Are the nuts toxic or not?
Okay, so probably the caller's thinking of the horse chestnut.
I don't know. They're not on the line, so we'll...
Yeah, sure. Well, that is a poisonous nut. Often horse chestnuts are planted in cities. It's a relative. We're talking about American and Chinese chestnuts, and those are certainly not only edible but incredibly delicious. So it's important.
So somehow or other they have to identify it in a book to see whether it's a horse chestnut or something else.
Yeah, and the seed hull is a very good indicator. The amount of sort of spikes or bumps on the seed hull. It's a pretty good one to identify. But your local extension or a local arborist can help you with that.
Yeah, I love the extension services, and ours does such a beautiful job, and they've done some things in organic, and they've done some research, and the University of Maryland has as well. I mean, what you say is so true, Steve, that, when I started this so long ago, it seems like forever ago, it has been almost my whole life, to see now so many hundreds of thousands of people calling for organic foods, using homeopathy, using acupuncture, understanding that there's these beautiful things that have been given to us that are in harmony with nature and the elements of nature. And of course, that's acupuncture itself is based on nature. We have a few minutes left, and I want to turn that over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks. I want to... I feel like one missing element of this that I've been really learning a lot from on our farm is the relationship of us and animals, where I think sometimes animals get a bad rap and are blamed a lot for climate change, and I want to just be clear that the way we are actually raising animals as farmers is actually what is causing the problem.
Exactly true.
When we take animals out of their habitat, we not only create an uncomfortable and stressful and demoralizing situation for them, but we create the context for something that contributes a lot to negative global warming. we've just seen over the last few years at our farm, when we bring animals back into their habitat, we see their joy, we see their happiness, and we see them living a really fulfilling life, and also contributing to building soil health. And we really couldn't do the work we do without the animals doing their incredible work to build soil. And we use our ducks, actually, with our mushroom production. They're great slug patrol members, so they actually go after the slugs that can sometimes threaten our mushroom crops. So what we seek is to recognize that in a positive farming system, the trees have a benefit, the mushrooms have a benefit, the animals have a benefit, but none of those alone does the job perfectly. They actually all do something slightly different, and they create together, this idea of an ecosystem. And so when I hear news about animals, it sometimes seems like we're thinking of them as the problem. But again, it's the way we treat and work with them. And I think it's the same with farming. Sometimes farming gets a bad rap as a contributor to climate change, but it's the way we're farming. We can actually farm in really powerful ways that reduce the pressure on our ecosystem.
Steve Gabriel, thank you so much for being with us. www.wellspringforestfarm.com. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus, and remember, we do need more love in the world.